Robert Edwin House was born in the heart of Las Vegas in June of 2020, a city already known for its contradictions, where glittering neon lights concealed vice, corruption, and ambition, and where the desert seemed to give rise to both great opportunity and great ruin. The world he entered was one of mounting tension, with the first signs of the global energy crisis already beginning to stir, and nations struggling to adapt to dwindling oil and uranium reserves. From the very beginning, House was unlike his peers. As a child, he demonstrated extraordinary intelligence, dismantling electronics not for play, but for study, rebuilding them into more efficient forms, and showcasing a precocious grasp of engineering and mathematics far beyond his years. Teachers described him as gifted, solitary, impatient with rote instruction, and dismissive of authority. Where other children sought games and companionship, Robert sought systems, knowledge, and control. He grew up without the stabilizing influence of a family. Both of his parents died while he was still young, leaving him with no direct attachments to hold him back or soften his nature. This loss hardened him, encouraging a reliance on himself and his intellect rather than on others. From this foundation came the worldview that defined his life, that chaos was inevitable, that people were fickle, and that only through planning, foresight, and technology could order be preserved. Unlike the humanists and idealists of his era, House's motivations were not rooted in community or altruism. His driving force was mastery, the ability to bend uncertainty to his will. By his late teens, House's brilliance carried him into the halls of prestigious institutions, including the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, which would one day become infamous in the post-war era as the foundation of the institute. But House's genius was matched only by his arrogance. He was not content to work within systems he found flawed, nor to submit to instructors he considered inferior. This defiance led to his expulsion, not for lack of talent, but for his unwillingness to compromise or obey authority. What might have crippled the ambitions of another man instead became fuel for House's independence. He cast aside the notion of following traditional paths and set out to chart his own destiny, one where he would answer only to himself. By the age of 22, he had done the unthinkable. With limited resources but boundless confidence, he founded Robco Industries in his home city of Las Vegas, staking his future on the belief that he could outthink, outbuild, and outmaneuver his competition. Robco quickly proved him right. The world of the mid-21st century was gripped by a technological revolution, with automation, robotics, and computing surging into every corner of life. House's company seized the moment, creating devices and machines that were not only advanced but practical and accessible. The Pip-Boy, developed in collaboration with Voltec, became standard issue in nearly every Volt constructed across America. Robco terminals, with their iconic green glow, became as ubiquitous in government offices and military bases as they were in homes. Protectrons, the robotic security units designed by Robco, became a common sight across cities, factories, and even shopping centers. In a matter of years, Robco went from an ambitious upstart to one of the most powerful corporations in the United States, rivaling giants such as Voltec, Poseidon Energy, and General Atomics International. Unlike most corporate leaders who relied on teams of engineers and bureaucrats to drive innovation, House remained intimately involved in every stage of development. His fingerprints were on every circuit, his ideas in every design, his vision behind every expansion. To work for Robco was to work for Robert House directly, whether one knew it or not. Success bred rivalries. Voltec, already entrenched with its ambitious Volt program, resented Robco's growing influence over consumer technology. Poseidon Energy, with its control of dwindling oil resources, eyed Robco's advances in automation as a potential threat to its dominance. Even Westtech, the defense contractor behind projects such as Power Armor and the Forced Evolutionary Virus, considered House a rival worth watching. Yet House did not measure his achievements in profits or contracts alone. For him, Robco was more than a corporation. It was an extension of himself, a machine for reshaping the world in his image. Where Voltech sought to manipulate humanity through controlled experiments, and Westtech meddled with human biology in pursuit of weapons, House sought order, preservation, and control through machinery, computation, and foresight. He was not content to let humanity stumble blindly toward ruin. He intended to calculate its survival. By the 2050 seconds, the crisis House had long predicted was unfolding. The resource wars erupted across the globe, with nations clashing over dwindling supplies of oil and uranium. Food riots broke out in major cities. Governments cracked down on their citizens, and corporations increasingly stepped in to fill the vacuum of authority. For House, this was not an unexpected catastrophe, but a confirmation of his calculations. He had long believed nuclear war was inevitable, and now he was proven right. Where others saw chaos, he saw the opportunity to prepare. House began laying the groundwork for the preservation of what he valued most. He did not mourn the decline of global stability. He did not wring his hands over the folly of nations. Instead, he focused on Las Vegas. It was here that his vision crystallized into one of the most ambitious survival projects in history. He poured his fortune into the construction of the Lucky 38 Casino, a building that would stand not only as a monument to the glamour of Las Vegas, but also as a fortress, a command hub, and a vault for himself. The Lucky 38 was unlike any other structure in the city, designed not for guests or gambling but for control. From its sealed command chambers, House prepared for the day the bombs would fall. He developed an automated army of Securitrons, capable of enforcing his will long after flesh and blood leaders had perished. He designed a defense system to shield Las Vegas from incoming nuclear strikes, one of the few measures in the entire country that successfully preserved a city through the apocalypse. And finally, he prepared for his own survival, commissioning life-preserving stasis systems that would keep his mind and body alive long after natural death should have claimed him. By the time the Great War loomed on the horizon, House had already transitioned from a man into something more. He was not merely a businessman, not merely a scientist, but an architect of the future. His childhood in the neon glow of Las Vegas, his formative years spent dismantling machines and rejecting authority, his early triumphs with Robco, and his rivalries with the giants of industry all converged into this single purpose: to endure where others would fail, and to ensure that his vision of civilization, rooted in order, technology, and rationality, would survive when the old world fell into ruin. For Robert House, the apocalypse was not an end, but a beginning. He would outlast governments, corporations, and nations. He would not only survive the end of the world, he would rule what came after. Robert Edwin House, now a young man of extraordinary confidence and ambition, stepped into the wider world with a vision that was as grand as it was uncompromising. Having founded Robco Industries at the astonishingly young age of 22, he positioned himself at the very heart of America's accelerating technological revolution. It was the middle of the 21st century, and the United States was experiencing both prosperity and tension, a time when consumer robotics, computing, and automation were not merely luxuries but necessities in a world strained by resource shortages and social unrest. While other entrepreneurs looked to exploit immediate opportunities for profit, House thought, in terms of decades and centuries, imagining a corporate empire that would not only dominate markets but would shape the very framework of human life. Robco began modestly, producing terminals, software, and early automated systems, but almost immediately, House saw the need to create products that could not be ignored, items that would insinuate themselves into every level of society, until Robco was not simply a brand, but a pillar of the modern age. His breakthrough came in the form of partnerships, and one in particular would make Robco a household name forever: its alliance with Vault-Tec. Vault-Tec, whose massive government contracts for underground shelters were already underway, required standardized systems for communications, record-keeping, and individual monitoring. House saw the opportunity and offered Robco's expertise. The result was the Pip-Boy, a personal computer so iconic, so ubiquitous, that it became synonymous with life inside the vaults. This device, strapped to the arm of every vault dweller, was more than a gadget. It was a symbol of Robco's integration into the fabric of survival itself. House ensured that Robco's logo, its software, and its operating systems became inseparable from the very idea of safety. Generations of vault dwellers, long after the bombs fell, would look at their Pip-Boys and, whether they knew his name or not, carry a piece of Robert House on their arms. The Pip-Boy was only the beginning. Robco terminals soon appeared everywhere, their glowing green screens filling offices, factories, and military bases. These terminals were not simply machines for work, they became the backbone of record-keeping across the United States. By designing them with both reliability and universality in mind, House created a monopoly in all but name. Where other companies might have guarded proprietary systems jealously, House ensured Robco's software was so widespread, so standardized, that alternatives became impractical. Robco's presence spread like a silent current, invisible yet indispensable. Alongside terminals came the Protectron, the robotic workforce and security force that reshaped civilian life. These boxy, clunky yet dependable machines patrolled streets, guarded facilities, and served as proof that Robco was not merely about abstract data, but about practical, tangible control of the physical world. Later, House's designs would expand into other robotic lines. The Mr. Handy, licensed to General Atomics but drawing on Robco systems, or the various iterations of security automatons that blurred the line between civilian utility and military might. Through it all, House maintained absolute oversight, never content to delegate vision to subordinates. Engineers and developers executed the details, but the concepts, the direction, and the overarching philosophy were his alone. The rise of Robco was meteoric, and with its rise came attention. Rivals watched nervously as House expanded. Poseidon Energy, deeply embedded in America's dwindling oil infrastructure, recognized that Robco's emphasis on efficiency and automation could reduce dependence on human labor and thereby shift economic leverage. Vault-Tec, though formerly partnered with House, resented his independence and his refusal to cede control of key designs. West-Tec, already a titan in defense research, saw in House a man unwilling to bow to government directives, a dangerous trait in a corporate world where government contracts determined survival. But House, unlike his rivals, cultivated a reputation not as a servant of Washington, but as a visionary in his own right. He did not chase contracts, contracts chased him. His products were so essential, his innovations so advanced, that even the government was forced to purchase his designs, however begrudgingly. And in House's mind, this relationship was crucial. He would supply them with what they needed, but he would never surrender to their authority. Robco was his, and his alone, and it would not become a puppet of any nation. As the decades rolled forward, Robco's expansion reached into every household, military base, and corporate office. The Pip-Boy grew through iterations, refined but never replaced, a constant reminder of the company's dominance. The terminals became synonymous with record-keeping and communication. The Protectrons, though limited in mobility and intelligence, became symbols of modern automation. And behind the walls of Robco headquarters, House continued to experiment with designs far ahead of their time, projects that would only come to light centuries later, when the Mojave Courier encountered Securitrons patrolling the New Vegas Strip. Already, House was imagining machines not as assistants, but as soldiers, enforcers, and guardians of a new world order. He anticipated the collapse of the old systems long before others dared to admit it. House's genius lay not only in his inventions, but in his ability to position them as indispensable. He created a world in which Robco was not merely another corporation, but the unseen infrastructure of daily life. It was House's code that ran through terminals in every office, House's machines that stood sentry in every city, House's designs that guided the hands of vault dwellers across the nation. In this way, he became a silent overseer of America, one whose reach extended into lives of millions who would never know his face. But House himself was no invisible recluse. In the pre-war years, he cultivated a reputation in business circles as eccentric, brilliant, and uncompromising. He attended negotiations with a cool detachment, dismissing sentiment and rhetoric in favor of numbers and inevitabilities. To deal with House was to deal with a man who seemed to think 100 moves ahead. His arrogance was notorious, his condescension legendary, but even his rivals admitted that he was rarely, if ever, wrong. As the 21st century progressed toward its midpoint, and the resource wars began to simmer into open conflict, Robco stood at the height of its power. House was already one of the wealthiest men in the United States, and his company one of its most powerful. But for House, wealth was not the objective. Money was a tool, a means of bending others to his will and fueling his greater ambitions. What he valued above all was control, and control required preparation. In the same years that Robco was supplying vaults with Pip-Boys, House was already investing heavily in projects that would secure not merely his company's future, but his own. He saw in the global tensions a confirmation of his predictions, the proof that humanity was marching blindly toward annihilation. Where other corporations looked only at their next quarter's profits, House looked at the next century and beyond. It was in this era that House began to set into motion the plans that would ultimately preserve him through the apocalypse. The Lucky 38 rose over Las Vegas as both a casino and a fortress, and while the public marveled at its design, few suspected the scale of the technology hidden within. Defense systems capable of intercepting incoming warheads, stasis chambers designed to extend his lifespan far beyond natural limits, and networks of machines intended to secure the city in the absence of government authority. All of these were fruits of the wealth and expertise Robco had provided. And yet, to the world, House remained simply a businessman, a corporate magnate at the head of an industry juggernaut. In truth, The rise of Robco was not simply the story of a company's growth, but of a man shaping the future through technology. The terminals, Pip-Boys, and Protectrons were not merely products, they were stepping stones, foundations upon which House could build something greater. Every innovation, every expansion, every alliance or rivalry was part of his larger calculation. While his rivals jockeyed for temporary dominance, House was preparing for a world that would be remade in fire. Robco's rise was not an end in itself, but a means, a way of ensuring that when the United States collapsed, when nations burned and governments fell, Robert House would remain standing atop the ashes, ready to seize what remained. In this sense, the story of Robco's ascent was inseparable from the story of House himself. To understand the company was to understand the man. Brilliant, arrogant, ruthless, and utterly certain that the chaos of the world could be bent to his will. The march of time carried Robert House from the height of corporate triumph into the gathering storm of nuclear war, a storm he alone among the magnates and officials of the pre-war United States had foreseen with cold clarity. For while the resource wars dragged nations into proxy conflicts and famine spread across the globe, House never mistook these events for temporary crises, but instead recognized them as the rumblings of a species devouring itself, a planet pushed to the brink by its own greed and short-sightedness, and in that recognition he saw not despair but opportunity. The chance to rise above the petty cycles of government corruption and corporate rivalry, and secure for himself the one commodity more valuable than oil, uranium, or water: time. His calculations were merciless, derived not from intuition or ideology, but from endless data analysis, simulations, and projections that left him convinced that nuclear war was not merely possible, but inevitable, a mathematical certainty in a world of dwindling resources and swelling militarism. For House, the United States was not a protector but a failing entity, a bloated and paranoid regime that would drag its citizens into annihilation under the guise of patriotic defense. He viewed Washington not as a patron to court, but as a dead weight to evade, and while other corporations threw themselves into military contracts, House invested his fortune into safeguarding himself, his city, and the legacy of his vision. Las Vegas, the jewel of the Mojave, was in House's eyes more than a tourist destination or a gambler's paradise. It was the perfect fortress, geographically isolated, minimally targeted by military infrastructure, and culturally symbolic of indulgence, wealth, and power. If the world burned, Las Vegas could survive, and Robert House would ensure that it did. To the public, the Lucky 38 rose as yet another opulent casino, a centerpiece of extravagance in a city already drowning in neon light and excess. But within its walls, House concealed defenses and technologies that dwarfed even the most ambitious government projects. Robco's terminals formed the nervous system, its software a lattice of interconnected data flows designed for total control, while deep within the superstructure, House commissioned defense platforms of astonishing sophistication, orbital systems, and interceptor arrays, designed to swat nuclear warheads out of the sky before they could reach Nevada, where the U.S. military obsessed over offense, power armor, laser rifles, FEV experimentation. House committed to survival, pouring his wealth into a shield that no rival corporation could imagine, let alone replicate. In parallel, House confronted the limitations of biology. His mind, brilliant and unyielding, might conceive plans that stretched across centuries, but his body was a frail vessel doomed by age and mortality. To transcend this barrier, he turned his attention inward, directing Robco's medical research into life extension technologies and cybernetic stasis. The systems he developed were staggering in their ambition, blending cryogenic suspension with neural preservation, nutrient filtration, and electronic monitoring, all designed to keep him alive indefinitely while his machines carried out his orders. Yet House understood the fragility of such mechanisms. No stasis system could preserve a man forever, but it could buy time, decades, perhaps centuries, enough for his plans to mature and his empire to rise from the ashes of civilization. This obsession was not vanity, but necessity. He did not trust humanity to guide itself through the inferno he knew was coming, and so he prepared to become the singular intelligence that would survive it, a god not by divinity, but by foresight and design. Even as House dug deeper into preparations, the world outside spiraled further toward destruction. The Sino-American War raged, consuming lives and resources at an unprecedented pace. And still House held himself apart, refusing to entangle Robco in the feeding frenzy of military contracts that devoured West Tech and Poseidon Energy. He sold what he must, securing wealth and influence, but he refused to place his genius at the disposal of a government he believed terminally doomed. His rivals mocked him as eccentric, too focused on vanity projects like the Lucky 38 to seize the fortunes of war. But they could not see what he saw, that those fortunes would soon be reduced to irradiated ash. House was never distracted by the chaos of the present. He lived in the certainty of the future, a future he had calculated with the precision of mathematics and the ruthlessness of a surgeon cutting away diseased flesh. When October 23, 2077 arrived, the day that would forever be remembered as the Great War, House's preparations were tested in the most absolute of crucibles. Even with his foresight and wealth, perfection eluded him, for though his orbital defense systems succeeded in intercepting most of the warheads targeted at Las Vegas, he had brought them online only 20 minutes before impact, a margin of error that cost him dearly. One bomb slipped through, detonating on the city's outskirts, and while Las Vegas was spared the annihilation suffered by other American cities, the blast wave and electromagnetic pulse devastated infrastructure, crippled power grids, and obliterated the city's civilian population. House himself, not yet fully integrated into his life extension chamber, suffered catastrophic physical damage from the strain of emergency management. His body irreversibly weakened, even as his mind endured. His dream of perfect preservation was marred, leaving him not as an immortal man, but as a husk sustained by machinery, bound to the systems of the Lucky 38 inches, a symbiosis that was equal parts triumph and tragedy. Yet survival, however imperfect, was victory. Where the governments of the world ceased to exist in fire and silence, House endured, entombed within his fortress yet alive, his machines humming endlessly in the service of their master. Las Vegas itself, though battered and emptied of life, remained a city of standing structures and glowing neon, a beacon of what had once been. Across the Mojave, the world crumbled into tribalism and ruin. Vaults sealed and later disgorged their populations. Raiders and survivalists fought over scraps, and still the Lucky 38 stood untouched, its doors sealed, its master watching. House, weakened but unbroken, spent the following centuries guiding his Securitron army, perfecting his networks, and waiting for the moment when humanity would crawl back from the wasteland in numbers sufficient for him to mold them into the civilization he had always envisioned. The shadow of nuclear war was, in truth, the light of House's ascension. He had predicted the apocalypse, prepared for it, and in surviving it had proven his supremacy over the nations and corporations that once laughed at his eccentricities. His body might be a fragile, decaying shell, but his mind was now unchallenged, his authority absolute, within the walls of New Vegas. From that shadow he would emerge centuries later, not as a man, but as a legend, a figure half mythical to the survivors who whispered of the mysterious ruler of the Lucky 38. In the calculus of Robert House, nuclear war was not the end of civilization, but its reset, the slate wiped clean for him alone to inscribe upon. And so, as the old world burned, House's new world awaited, coiled in silence, ready to spring forth when the time was right. Through the centuries that followed the detonation of nuclear fire, Robert Edwin House endured a state of existence that could scarcely be called life, yet could not be called death either, suspended in a delicate balance between decay and machinery inside the heart of the Lucky 38, a monument to both his genius and his imperfection. For though he had survived where governments and nations had not, his preservation systems had failed to achieve the pristine immortality he had imagined, leaving him a skeletal husk tethered to a complex web of tubes, circuits, and life support technologies that maintained his brain's vitality while his body withered away. And in this condition, House began what could only be described as his long sleep, an era of silent vigilance, during which he monitored the wasteland beyond his casino walls, cataloguing the decline of humanity, watching tribes rise and fall, and directing his machines with clinical detachment to ensure that when the time came, he could re-emerge, not as a relic, but as the architect of the new age. The first decades after the Great War were the darkest, for the Mojave was stripped of order and filled with radiation. Roving bands of survivors clawing at life with desperation while vaults opened sporadically, their inhabitants either perishing in the harsh desert or assimilating into the fractured societies forming in the ruins. House's Securitrons patrolled in limited capacity, their movements restrained by his weakened ability to maintain full operational control. But even in these constrained years, he ensured that no one breached the Lucky 38. Preserving its sanctity as the cradle of his rebirth, he recorded events obsessively, noting the collapse of regional power structures, the migrations of displaced peoples, and the slow degradation of technology into superstition, all of which confirmed the accuracy of his pre-war projections that humanity, left unguided, would regress into tribalism. As the centuries passed, House's physical state grew ever more precarious, his biological frame ravaged by time, yet sustained by the machinery he had designed to compensate for inevitable system failures. His neural activity remained sharp, his mind racing with calculations, models, and predictions, but he was trapped, unable to act with the same immediacy he had once commanded. The Mojave outside evolved in strange ways. Its geography largely spared the catastrophic fallout that obliterated other regions, leaving its resources comparatively intact. Tribes began to dominate the land, the three families, the Khans, the followers of the apocalypse, and countless smaller groups, each rising, warring, and falling in cycles that House regarded as both predictable and wasteful. He saw in them echoes of pre-war humanity, the same short-sightedness, the same susceptibility to greed and violence, and he grew ever more convinced that only his intervention could redirect this cycle toward true civilization. He nurtured this conviction as centuries wore on, planning, refining, and adapting his strategies for governance, economy, and infrastructure, all to be enacted once he could gather sufficient force to re-establish order. Throughout this long vigil, House maintained New Vegas itself, or rather the bones of what had been New Vegas, keeping its core structures intact through automated maintenance systems and selective deployment of Securitrons. While other cities fell into dust, their monuments stripped of meaning, and their streets reclaimed by wilderness, the Strip endured, neon still flickering against the night sky, a beacon of continuity in a world consumed by entropy. Travelers, scavengers, and tribes all whispered of the city that glowed, untouched by looters and seemingly inviolate, a place where fortune might be made, but from which few returned, for House did not permit intrusion into the Lucky 38, and he allowed no power to destabilize his preparation. In this way, he cultivated mystique, a mythology of New Vegas, as a forbidden place, a legend that reinforced his authority without his having to expend his dwindling energy directly. In truth, House was as vulnerable as he had ever been, his body incapable of surviving without constant calibration and repair of life support systems. Yet his legend made him untouchable. As centuries became nearly 200 years, new forces rose beyond the Mojave, most notably the new California Republic, which emerged from the shattered remnants of Vault 15 and its surrounding communities. The NCR expanded aggressively westward, embodying many of the ideals of pre-war America: representative government, military organization, and relentless expansionism. House observed their rise with both fascination and disdain, recognizing in them the same structural flaws that had doomed the old world: corruption, inefficiency, and short-sighted governance masked by democratic rhetoric. Yet he also recognized their potential as a stabilizing force, a blunt instrument that could serve his purposes if properly controlled. On the opposite end, to the east, he noted the rise of Caesar's Legion, a brutal autocracy forged by Edward Sallow out of tribal populations, a society predicated on slavery, conquest, and absolute domination. Where the NCR represented the flawed rebirth of old-world democracy, the Legion represented humanity's descent into primal cruelty, both destined to clash in the Mojave, both useful to House as pieces in his larger game. House's long sleep was therefore not one of idleness, but of constant surveillance and planning, a vigil wherein he sharpened his strategy into something more ruthless and refined than even his pre-war calculations had conceived. He had once believed that survival and infrastructure would be enough to restore humanity, but centuries of watching degradation had hardened him, convincing him that people could not be trusted with freedom in the early stages of rebuilding. They required control, guidance, and above all, the presence of a singular intelligence that would not falter to corruption or weakness. In this sense, House saw himself not as a dictator, but as a steward, a custodian of civilization who would impose order until humanity could be trusted again to govern itself, though whether he ever truly intended to relinquish that control remains uncertain. The turning point in this long vigil came with the arrival of the Courier, a seemingly insignificant figure in the vast wasteland whose journey across the Mojave would awaken House fully from his centuries of slumber. By this time, House had refined his control of the Securitrons, expanded his surveillance networks, and prepared the Strip for an influx of commerce and governance. He had entered into carefully controlled alliances with the three families, reshaping them from warring tribes into organized factions: the chairman, the Omertas, and the White Glove Society, who managed the casinos on the Strip under his supervision, their loyalty secured through manipulation, coercion, and the promise of profit. He positioned himself not as a visible monarch but as a hidden power, a reclusive yet omnipresent ruler whose directives shaped every transaction and whose silence only deepened his aura of authority. The Strip became a functioning microcosm of the civilization he envisioned, orderly, prosperous, and immune to the chaos of the wastes, though propped up entirely by the machinery and will of one man. By the time of the Courier's arrival, House had not spoken to an outsider in generations. His voice transmitted through monitors and speakers, his form represented by a stylized, idealized portrait of the man he had once been. He concealed his true physical condition, knowing that the sight of his ruined body would undermine the carefully constructed mythos of his enduring perfection. Yet the mind behind the image remained sharp, calculating every possible outcome of the Mojave's brewing conflict. The NCR pushed eastward, eager to claim the Hoover Dam and the resources of the Mojave, while Caesar's legion advanced from the east, seeking conquest and domination. House, watching from his tower, understood that this confrontation would provide the crucible he had been waiting for, a conflict in which he could assert his power, manipulate both sides, and secure the future of New Vegas as the capital of a new civilization under his rule. And so the long sleep, centuries of frailty and silence, ended not with fanfare, but with the quiet recognition that the pieces on the board were finally aligned. House's preservation systems had kept him alive long enough to witness the rebirth of power in the wasteland, and he intended to shape that rebirth into something lasting, something greater than the governments that had failed before. He emerged from dormancy not as the man he had been, but as something more and less, a decaying body held together by tubes and steel, yet a mind sharpened by centuries of solitude, prepared to impose a vision upon the Mojave that he had carried with him since before the bombs fell. In this way, House's long sleep was not a decline but a transformation, the cocoon within which the old magnate dissolved and from which the self-styled savior of civilization prepared to emerge. When the year 2274 arrived, it marked not simply the passing of time in the wasteland, but the moment when Robert House, silent for nearly 2 centuries, stirred from his long seclusion within the Lucky 38 and turned his gaze outward once again, surveying a Mojave that had grown strange and chaotic in his absence, yet ripe for the careful application of his intellect and machines. For though the centuries of stasis had eroded his body into a husk barely sustained by life support, his mind had endured with clarity, and with that mind he assessed the tribes, the travelers, the merchants, and the soldiers who had come to inhabit the lands he had once vowed to protect. His awakening was not the result of accident or curiosity, but the inevitable consequence of his calculations. For House had foreseen that the dam, the Strip, and the Mojave would one day be essential to his vision, and as NCR expansion pressed eastward, and whispers of a growing empire under Caesar spread across the wasteland, he knew the time had come to move from passive observation to active intervention. The world beyond the walls of the Lucky 38 had changed since the day the bombs fell, but House had not survived for 2 centuries to be a mere relic. He intended to reassert control, to bend the chaos into order, and to begin at last the execution of the plan he had preserved himself to fulfill. Emerging from centuries of near isolation, House found that Las Vegas itself had become a ruin of half-remembered glories, its neon extinguished, its grand casinos turned to crumbling shells, its streets haunted by scavengers and tribes who knew little of the city's history and cared even less. Where once the Strip had embodied entertainment and modern excess, It now lay dormant, its skeleton awaiting the spark of revival. The Mojave outside the city had fragmented into countless tribes, some little more than nomadic raiders, others eking out subsistence in hovels and camps, their cultures shaped by violence and scarcity rather than by ambition or design. To House, these tribes were both obstacle and opportunity. Their primitiveness made them incapable of restoring civilization on their own, but their malleability meant they could be reshaped into instruments of his will. From the heights of the Lucky 38, House began the process of surveying and cataloging the wasteland, identifying potential allies, potential enemies, and the precise methods by which the Strip could once more be transformed into the heart of civilization. His awakening was therefore not dramatic but methodical, a gradual reassertion of control through observation, planning, and the careful deployment of his Securitrons, who had stood ready in stasis as faithfully as their master. House's first moves upon awakening were not directed outward with reckless haste, but inward, toward the resurrection of the Strip itself. He understood that the Mojave tribes could only be organized around a central symbol, a place of prosperity and order that would inspire loyalty and awe. The Strip, once the pride of Las Vegas, would become that symbol, but it could not do so as a ruin. House therefore reactivated key systems within the Lucky 38, restored portions of the power grid, and began the process of cleansing the Strip of scavengers and squatters. His Securitrons, long silent, marched once more, their presence a sudden and terrifying reminder that this stretch of neon-lit desert belonged not to raiders, not to NCR soldiers, not to wandering traders, but to Robert House alone. Within weeks, the Strip had been cleared of undesirables, its entrances guarded by machines whose unwavering loyalty and unerring precision made them more effective than any human garrison could ever hope to be. The mere presence of the Securitrons marked the beginning of the Strip's rebirth, for the tribes and travelers of the Mojave, accustomed to the law of might and the chaos of the wastes, suddenly encountered a vision of order. They could neither resist nor ignore, but House knew that machines alone could not create culture, and so his second act was the transformation of the tribes themselves. Scattered across the Mojave were groups whose crude traditions and disorganized violence made them dangerous yet pliable, and House set about molding them into the foundation of his new social order. He selected 3 of the most promising tribes, each distinct, each capable of being repurposed, and through a mixture of intimidation, negotiation, and subtle manipulation, he transformed them into the so-called 3 families, the custodians of the Strip's reborn casinos. The chairmen, once violent and undisciplined, were remade into suave entertainers whose casino, the Tops, would embody sophistication and charm. The White Glove Society, emerging from a tribe with grotesque cannibalistic traditions, were refashioned into aristocrats whose veneer of refinement concealed their darker appetites. The Omertas, crude raiders at first, were shaped into a syndicate of organized criminals whose brutality was hidden beneath a thin layer of respectability. House did not seek to erase these tribes' natures entirely, but to redirect them, to channel their primal instincts into roles that would serve his larger vision. The Strip would thrive not because these families had changed at their core, but because House had repurposed their vices into controlled expressions of power, entertainment, and wealth. The awakening of House in 2274 therefore represented more than a man re-emerging into the world. It was the calculated rebirth of Las Vegas itself. Where wastelanders saw a ruin, House saw the framework of empire. Where raiders saw a place to plunder, House saw a fortress. Where tribes saw chaos, House imposed order. His actions during this period were not reckless gambits, but the opening moves of a man who had already calculated the entire game, a chess master advancing pawns with the certainty that his opponent's defeat was inevitable. The Strip, once again lit by neon and guarded by machines, became the nucleus around which House would rebuild civilization. Travelers from across the Mojave were drawn to it, lured by the promise of wealth, security, and decadence. And in this way, House began to reassert not only control but influence, establishing the Strip as a beacon visible for miles, a reminder that while the wasteland outside remained savage, here within the shadow of the Lucky 38, civilization still lived. For House, the year 2274 was the moment when centuries of preparation finally bore fruit, when his long sleep gave way to purposeful action, and when the Mojave ceased to be a wilderness of tribes and began its transformation into the heart of his envisioned future. Yet his awakening was not the culmination of his plans, but only their beginning. For even as he re-established control over the Strip and bent the tribes into his service, he cast his gaze outward, toward the looming threats of the NCR and Caesar's Legion, forces he knew would one day converge upon Hoover Dam and upon New Vegas itself. His reawakening was therefore a declaration of intent, a silent proclamation to the wasteland that Robert House, master of the Lucky 38 and architect of civilization's survival, had returned to claim his destiny. The Strip and the three families formed the living heart of Robert House's post-apocalyptic vision, the embodiment of his determination to transform New Vegas into a symbol of stability and prosperity in a wasteland otherwise defined by ruin, and the process by which he achieved this was as much psychological manipulation as it was technological dominance. For House understood that human beings required ritual, spectacle, and hierarchy every bit as much as they required food, water, and shelter, and he set about engineering these elements with the same meticulous care he once applied to terminals and pip-boys. In the early centuries after the Great War, the ruins of Las Vegas were home to disparate tribes that fought savagely for scraps, groups as brutal and disorganized as any other in the Mojave. Yet House, still entombed within the Lucky 38, surveyed them with the cold detachment of a chess master examining pawns on a board. He could not yet emerge directly, for his frail body and limited resources forbade it, but his Securitrons provided him with both protection and influence, machines whose presence alone elevated him above the level of a mortal leader, and suggested to the primitive survivors that a greater intelligence ruled the glowing Strip. Over decades, he made his first great sociological experiment, the restructuring of three particular tribes into functional organizations that could run the Strip's casinos, ensuring that New Vegas would not only appear prosperous, but would actively generate wealth and stability, proof to the Mojave that civilization was not only possible, but thriving under his guidance. The chairmen were the first of these engineered societies, a tribe of wastelanders given purpose, elegance, and a veneer of old-world sophistication under House's careful supervision. He groomed them into casino operators, supplying them with the trappings of pre-war glamour, fine suits, polished manners, and a sense of exclusivity that transformed them from raiders into hosts of a new age of entertainment. House knew that image was power, and in the Mojave's barren context, the glitter of tuxedos and champagne was as commanding as any army. To the chairman, he offered the promise of wealth and prestige, binding them to his rule with both fear of his machines and desire for his approval. The omertas, by contrast, were sculpted from another raw material entirely, molded from a tribe steeped in violence and opportunism into a syndicate modeled after the ruthless crime families of Old World America. House did not suppress their brutality, but redirected it, allowing them to channel their aggression into the operation of Gomorrah, a casino that served both as entertainment and as a controlled outlet for vice. By granting the Omertas an arena in which to profit from their darker instincts, while surrounding them with the invisible leash of his surveillance, House ensured they would remain dangerous, but useful, a blade always pointed outward rather than at him. Finally came the White Glove Society, transformed from a barbaric, cannibalistic tribe into a parody of aristocracy. Dressed in masks and finery, their old practices sublimated into rituals of exclusivity and decadence. Where once they were feared for their hunger, House rebranded them as patrons of refinement, their grotesque appetites hidden beneath layers of etiquette and ritual, tolerated, so long as they obeyed his rules and maintained the illusion of civility. These three families became the core of the Strip, their casinos serving as both economic engines and cultural symbols, their members proud to inhabit roles that elevated them from tribal obscurity to positions of influence. House ruled them with a balance of reward and intimidation, never permitting them to forget that without him they were nothing, yet never denying them the small freedoms and indulgences that made their loyalty more palatable. His Securitrons patrolled the streets, enforcing laws with mechanical precision, their ever-present screens projecting House's stylized face, a reminder that the master of the city watched at all times. The Strip itself, carefully maintained and restored by House's machines, glittered in stark contrast to the wasteland beyond its borders, neon lights blazing each night, as though the Great War had never occurred. To scavengers and travelers, the Strip seemed a miracle, a pocket of abundance in a desert of ruin, and rumors spread of its enigmatic ruler, a man no one had seen in centuries, but whose will shaped every corner of the city. House understood the psychological impact of spectacle better than any warlord or tribal chief. Where others sought to inspire fear through violence, he inspired awe through opulence, constructing an environment that whispered of continuity, luxury, and possibility. The Strip became a living myth, a place where caps flowed freely, where gamblers risked everything at tables lit by electric brilliance, where guards never tired and rules were enforced without corruption or delay. It was not merely a settlement, but a vision of civilization reborn, crafted meticulously to prove that order was possible even after the apocalypse. House, confined though he was, wielded the Strip as a statement that he alone had the foresight to preserve culture, and that his authority was not only necessary but inevitable. His manipulation of the three families was not exploitation in his mind but education, a proving ground for humanity's capacity to rise above barbarism under the guidance of a singular, uncompromising intelligence. The Strip's economic model was as calculated as its culture. Every cap earned by the casinos funneled upward, enriching House's coffers and fueling the maintenance of his machines. Caravan traders who reached New Vegas found not chaos but structure, contracts enforced by impartial Securitrons rather than corrupt human officials. Visitors from the NCR to the west, or even Caesar's scouts from the east, encountered a city unlike any other in the wasteland, one where law existed not by consensus or brute force, but by the invisible hand of a master planner. House taxed, regulated, and organized with precision, ensuring that the Strip remained profitable, orderly, and beyond the reach of anarchic forces. By the time the Courier entered the Mojave, the Strip was no longer a fragile experiment, but a thriving entity, the envy of every other power in the region, its survival and prosperity owed entirely to the unseen figure in the Lucky 38. Yet beneath the glitter, House never forgot that his experiment was fragile, dependent on his continued oversight and the obedience of his subjects. The omertas whispered of independence, the white gloves wrestled with the temptation of their old practices, and the chairmen toyed with indulgences that could corrupt their veneer of civility. House tolerated no disobedience, his machines quick to punish deviations, but he recognized that these flaws were symptoms of humanity's nature, proof of why he alone must remain in control. In the strip's successes and failures, he saw confirmation of his philosophy, that people required guidance, discipline, and a firm hand, lest they descend once again into savagery. The Strip was not simply an entertainment district, it was a laboratory of civilization, a stage upon which House tested his theories of governance, preparing to expand them to the entire Mojave and eventually beyond. Thus, the creation of the Strip and the molding of the three families was not an isolated act of survival, but the first manifestation of Robert House's grand design. It was the proof of concept for his larger dream, the tangible evidence that his foresight and control could transform chaos into order, that even in a world scarred by nuclear fire, humanity could be reshaped into something resembling culture, prosperity, and power. Each family, each casino, each light on the Strip was part of a greater machine, a mechanism designed to validate House's claim that he, and he alone, possessed the wisdom to guide the future. And in the glow of neon, beneath the watchful eyes of his Securitrons, the myth of New Vegas was born. A myth that would soon collide with the ambitions of the NCR, the brutality of Caesar's legion, and the choices of a single courier who would decide whether House's vision would dominate the Mojave or vanish into history. Robert House's relationship with the new California Republic was defined by equal measures of contempt, calculation, and necessity. For though he regarded the NCR as a bloated reincarnation of the old world's flaws, he also understood that their sheer size and momentum made them an unavoidable presence in the Mojave, and so he prepared to treat them not as partners, nor as equals, but as tools to be manipulated and obstacles to be contained, their ambitions useful insofar as they aligned with his own, their inefficiencies proof of why his singular vision must prevail in the end. The NCR had risen from the modest beginnings of Shady Sands, a settlement of Vault 15 survivors who built a functioning government on the bones of democracy, a republic that mirrored the United States in both its ideals and its inevitable corruption. Its expansion across California and into Nevada was driven by a mixture of idealism and pragmatism, a belief in law, infrastructure, and order on the one hand, and on the other, an insatiable hunger for resources, territory, and taxation. House, monitoring their rise from his throne in the Lucky 38, recognized the NCR as the most advanced political entity in the post-war West, but also the most predictable, a lumbering bureaucracy incapable of true innovation and doomed to collapse under its own contradictions. Where House had spent centuries honing his survival into a precise vision of civilization, the NCR stumbled forward with the arrogance of a people who believed themselves destined to restore America, without ever acknowledging that America had destroyed itself by following the very path they now retraced. House's contempt for the NCR was rooted not only in their flaws, but in their presumption, for he saw in their government a reflection of everything he despised about pre-war politics. Politicians motivated by personal gain, a military stretched too thin to sustain its campaigns, citizens indoctrinated into patriotic rhetoric, while the underlying structures decayed. To him, the NCR was not civilization reborn, but civilization repeating its mistakes, an engine of expansion that would grind itself into irrelevance, just as the United States had before the bombs fell. Yet he was pragmatic enough to recognize that their resources, their manpower, and their infrastructure made them valuable instruments. The Strip, though thriving, was not yet a nation, and House required both time and space to expand his influence. By allowing the NCR to extend into the Mojave, to establish bases, outposts, and trade routes, House created a buffer against the chaos of the wider wasteland. He permitted them to police areas beyond the Strip, to confront raiders and tribes who might otherwise have threatened his carefully cultivated order. In essence, he outsourced the Mojave's preliminary stabilization to the NCR, all the while ensuring that they remained unaware of just how much he benefited from their presence. The greatest point of contention between House and the NCR was the Hoover Dam, the colossal pre-war structure that had survived the Great War largely intact, its hydroelectric capacity the key to dominating the Mojave. For the NCR, control of the dam represented not only power for New Vegas and the outlying regions, but a symbol of legitimacy, proof that they could reclaim the technological marvels of the old world and bend them to their authority. For House, the dam was the linchpin of his grand design, the energy source that would fuel his transformation of the Strip into a metropolis and eventually expand his dominion far beyond Nevada. He had known since before the bombs fell that Hoover Dam would be indispensable, and his survival through the centuries was predicated in part on the calculation that one day he would control it. Thus, when the NCR moved to claim it, House regarded their efforts with a cold patience, recognizing that their stewardship of the dam was temporary, their ability to hold it fragile, their bureaucracy too unwieldy to defend it against the coming storm of Caesar's legion. In this, House saw an opportunity. The inevitable conflict between NCR and Legion would weaken both, leaving him in the perfect position to seize the dam and secure its power for himself. House's dealings with the NCR were conducted with his characteristic blend of manipulation and superiority. He communicated with their representatives sparingly, always through intermediaries or his mechanical proxies, never revealing the full extent of his knowledge or intentions. To them, he presented himself as a business magnate, a powerful but ultimately local figure whose concern was limited to the prosperity of New Vegas. He allowed them to believe that their expansion was tolerated rather than orchestrated, that their presence in the Mojave was the result of their own initiative rather than part of his design. Behind this facade, House monitored every troop movement, every negotiation, every act of corruption within their ranks, and he judged them with the disdain of a man certain of his intellectual superiority. To NCR officials, the Strip was a nuisance, a place of decadence they could never fully control. To House, the NCR was a blunt instrument, a temporary actor whose role was to clear the stage of chaos before his own performance began. Yet House did not underestimate the NCR. He recognized that, for all their flaws, they possessed determination and numbers. Their capacity for organization, however clumsy, far surpassed that of the fractured tribes and petty warlords that plagued the wasteland. In the short term, their presence stabilized trade, secured routes, and brought resources to the Mojave that would otherwise have remained inaccessible. House exploited these advantages, permitting NCR caravans to pass through the Strip, profiting from taxation and commerce, all while ensuring that the true balance of power remained with him. He was patient, knowing that the NCR's corruption and overextension would eventually erode their ability to hold the region. When that collapse came, he would be ready to absorb the infrastructure they had left behind, seamlessly transferring authority from their bloated government to his own efficient rule. The NCR, for their part, regarded House with suspicion. They could not ignore his control over the Strip, nor his refusal to submit to their authority. Yet they lacked the resources to confront him directly. To them, he was an enigma, a pre-war relic whose influence persisted far longer than anyone could explain. They whispered of his immortality, speculated about his methods, but never pierced the veil of his secrecy. This uncertainty served House well, for in their ignorance they consistently underestimated him, viewing him as a stubborn local magnate rather than the singular intelligence who had foreseen the apocalypse and survived it. By the time the Courier arrived, tensions between House and the NCR were simmering but not yet boiling, a fragile equilibrium sustained only by House's careful manipulation and the NCR's reluctance to provoke a conflict that might jeopardize their hold on Hoover Dam. To House, the NCR was never a partner and never a threat, but always a temporary phase in the long arc of his plan. They were the scaffolding upon which he would build, the laborers who unknowingly prepared the Mojave for his ascension. Their flaws made them predictable, their corruption made them vulnerable, and their ambitions made them reckless. But all of these traits also made them useful. In his private calculations, the NCR was already doomed, destined to collapse under the weight of its contradictions, leaving behind only the structures and systems that he would appropriate. In this sense, House's view of the NCR was an extension of his broader philosophy that human institutions, left to themselves, would always fail, and that only his singular vision, unclouded by weakness or compromise, could endure. The NCR might claim to be the heirs of America, but in House's mind, America had failed, and their inheritance was nothing but ashes. He alone would claim the true mantle of civilization, and the NCR, whether they realized it or not, were merely his stepping stone. Robert House regarded Caesar's legion not as a rival worthy of admiration, but as a brutal aberration, a regressive force that epitomized everything he considered antithetical to civilization. And though he respected the efficiency of its command structure and the discipline it imposed upon its followers, he dismissed its ideology as barbaric, its methods as crude, and its longevity as untenable in a world where only technological mastery and rational governance could endure beyond the savagery of the wasteland. To House, Caesar himself was an intelligent man, a manipulator who understood the uses of fear and the power of myth, but he was still ultimately a creature of the post-war world, a tribal warlord cloaked in stolen classical rhetoric, attempting to forge an empire from brutality without the infrastructure, science, or foresight required to sustain it. House, who had lived through the height of human civilization and had seen it collapse in nuclear fire, recognized in Caesar's legion not a rebirth of Rome but a parody of it, a society that would collapse as quickly as it had risen. Its reliance on conquest, ensuring that once expansion ceased, its rot would be laid bare for all to see. From his vantage in the Lucky 38, House observed the legion's rise east of the Colorado River with cold detachment, studying its movements, its campaigns, and its culture with the analytical precision of a man who viewed history as a series of predictable cycles. He saw in Caesar's conquests the same pattern that had played out countless times in human history, a charismatic leader binding disparate tribes into a single martial force, enforcing order through terror and extending his reach through conquest. Such a model could dominate in the short term, but it was inherently unsustainable, for it produced no lasting institutions, no technological advancements, no genuine culture beyond subjugation. Where House envisioned a future of neon-lit cities powered by Hoover Dam's energy, filled with commerce, innovation, and industry, Caesar envisioned a wasteland empire where men were slaves, women were property, and violence was the only law. For House, the clash between his vision and Caesar's was not merely political but existential, a contest between civilization and regression, the outcome of which would determine whether the Mojave's future would be paved with silicon or drenched in blood. House's analysis of the Legion led him to a conclusion he considered unshakable. They could not be negotiated with, for their ideology rejected compromise, and they could not coexist with his vision, for they sought domination over all they encountered. Thus, the only logical course was their destruction, though House preferred to let the NCR bear the brunt of that battle. He understood that the Legion's reliance on terror made them formidable in the field, their soldiers hardened by brutal discipline, their command structure fanatically loyal to Caesar. Yet he also knew that their military efficiency was a thin veneer concealing fragility, for once Caesar fell, the entire edifice would crumble into infighting and collapse. This insight guided his strategy. He would not seek to confront the Legion prematurely, nor would he expend his own resources in wasteful conflict. Instead, he would let NCR and Legion bleed each other dry at Hoover Dam, only to step in at the decisive moment, his Securitron army upgraded and invincible, securing victory for New Vegas not by attrition but by precision. House's disdain for the Legion was perhaps strongest in his view of its treatment of human potential. For a man who had devoted his life to preserving and advancing humanity through technology, who believed in the supremacy of rational planning over base instincts, the Legion's reduction of human beings to slaves and fodder for war was an abomination. He saw in their culture no appreciation for science, no drive for progress, no recognition of the achievements that had once defined humanity at its height. Where he sought to resurrect civilization's pinnacle through careful stewardship of resources and knowledge, the Legion sought to strip humanity down to its most primitive instincts, glorifying brutality as strength and submission as order. To House, this was not merely an alternate path, but an outright threat to the species' survival. For a world ruled by Caesar would never reach the stars, never rebuild industry, never escape the cycle of warlords and empires that had plagued humanity for millennia. Despite his contempt, House never underestimated the Legion. He respected their ability to inspire fear, to impose order on chaotic tribes, and to project power across vast territories with limited technology. He understood that their soldiers, conditioned through brutality, could withstand horrors that would break lesser men, and he acknowledged the tactical genius with which Caesar directed his campaigns. But he also recognized their weaknesses, their dependence on Caesar's charisma and intellect, their lack of institutional knowledge, their disdain for technology that left them vulnerable to an opponent who wielded machines with precision. House knew that when the Second Battle of Hoover Dam came, the Legion would rely on overwhelming force, throwing their armies against the dam in a storm of blood, believing that discipline and terror would carry the day. Against NCR's rifles and artillery, the outcome might be uncertain, but against an army of Securitrons, immune to fear, unrelenting in firepower, and directed by his strategic genius, House was certain the Legion would be annihilated. In this calculation, lay the essence of House's philosophy, that survival and progress depended not on ideology or brute strength, but on foresight, technology, and the ability to manipulate events so that one's enemies destroyed themselves before a single decisive blow was struck. He saw the NCR, Legion, as mirror images of one another, one a bloated democracy doomed by inefficiency, the other a brutal autocracy doomed by its own barbarism. Both were destined to fall, and House intended to be the one who rose from their ashes. To him, the Legion was not the future, but the last gasp of humanity's primitive past, a reminder of what must be overcome if civilization was to endure. And so, when he looked east across the Colorado River, he did not see a rival empire but a temporary threat, one that would soon be swept aside by the precision of his machines and the inevitability of his vision. House's ultimate verdict on Caesar's Legion was as cold as it was final. They were a cancer that must be excised, a barbaric empire that could never be allowed to prevail. He did not hate them, for hate was an emotion beneath his calculating mind. He merely judged them irrelevant, an obstacle to be removed in the pursuit of a destiny far greater than any wasteland warlord could imagine. While Caesar dreamed of conquest and glory, House dreamed of stars and eternity. In that contrast lay the true measure of their conflict, and in House's mind, there could be no doubt which vision would survive. The forging of New Vegas was not the spontaneous rebirth of a city, but the deliberate execution of a plan long calculated by Robert House, who, having awakened in 2274 and re-established his presence upon the ruined strip, now turned his full attention toward reshaping that desolate ruin into the shining nucleus of his vision for post-war civilization, a place that would dazzle travelers, dominate commerce, and stand as a testament to the fact that even in the irradiated wasteland, order and prosperity could be achieved under his guidance. Unlike the NCR, who clumsily extended their bureaucracy wherever their troops marched, or Caesar's Legion, who imposed order through fire and slavery, House pursued a subtler strategy, one grounded in manipulation, symbolism, and spectacle, for he knew that the Strip could not merely be a fortress, it had to be an idea, a beacon that lured people from across the Mojave and beyond with promises of wealth and indulgence, while concealing the iron hand of his authority within the glamour of casinos and neon. The Strip's transformation began with the tribes, those chaotic remnants of humanity whom House had deliberately molded into the three families, and by investing them with both power and responsibility, he created the illusion of shared governance, while ensuring that, in reality, every decision, every profit, and every drop of blood spilled upon the Strip served his greater design. The chairmen, once a savage tribe that reveled in unrestrained violence, were among the first to be reshaped, their brutality refined into charm under House's tutelage, their roughness polished, until they could convincingly play the role of suave hosts and entertainers, perfect custodians for the Tops Casino, which House reimagined as the Strip's flagship of glamour and decadence. By giving the chairmen a new identity, he preserved their aggression in controlled form, ensuring that beneath their polished exterior lay the same readiness for violence that had once defined them, but now it was directed in service of maintaining order on the casino floor, intimidating those who broke the rules, and projecting an aura of controlled sophistication that would lure visitors into believing they had stepped into a vision of the old world reborn. In the same way, House transformed the White Glove Society, whose grotesque cannibalistic traditions might have otherwise made them pariahs, into the epitome of aristocracy, dressing their vices in velvet and etiquette, ensuring that the Strip would possess not only entertainment, but a veneer of refinement, a class of elites whose presence suggested culture and exclusivity, even as their darker appetites simmered beneath the surface. And for balance, he gave power to the ometers, channeling their crude raiding instincts into organized crime, ensuring that the Strip would always contain a shadowy underworld to handle those tasks, too distasteful to be performed openly, while keeping them firmly under his control, aware that their ambition would never surpass the reach of his Securitrons. Through these three families, House established a dynamic ecosystem on the Strip, one that mirrored the complexities of pre-war society, but stripped of its inefficiencies, for while the families squabbled among themselves, postured, and maintained the illusion of independence, none of them held true authority. Their casinos operated because House permitted them, their wealth flowed only because he allowed it, and their lives continued only because they served his greater vision. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, the kind of layered governance that appeared decentralized to outsiders, but was in fact orchestrated by a single calculating mind. The Strip became a spectacle, not merely because of its neon lights or rebuilt casinos, but because House designed it to be a symbol, a place where wastelanders could glimpse something beyond the dirt and violence of their lives, where merchants could dream of profits, where travelers could forget the brutality outside the gates, and where all were subtly reminded that such prosperity existed only because Robert House willed it so. The reawakening of commerce was central to this forging process, for House understood that wealth was as powerful a tool as military might, and that the Strip could dominate not only through intimidation, but through economic gravity. By taxing caravans, ensuring security along trade routes, and providing a market unlike any other in the Mojave, he turned New Vegas into the economic heart of the region, drawing caravans from NCR territories, from distant settlements, and even from those who traveled eastward from Legion lands, seeking goods they could find nowhere else. In this way, New Vegas became indispensable even to those who despised House. For merchants and traders who might have scorned his authority nevertheless flocked to the Strip, their livelihoods entwined with its success. Every chip spent in a casino, every deal struck in a hotel, every shipment taxed at the gate became another strand in the web of control. House wove around the Mojave, unlike the NCR, who struggled to extend supply lines across deserts, or the Legion, who extracted wealth solely through conquest. House positioned himself at the crossroads of commerce, ensuring that no one could ignore him, and that the Strip would thrive regardless of the political tides sweeping the wasteland. The Strip's forging was not without resistance, for the tribes were not easily domesticated, nor were the wastes free of threats. But House's unyielding reliance on technology provided the answer. His Securitrons, tireless and incorruptible, patrolled the gates, the casinos, and the streets, their ever-watchful presence making clear that violence against the Strip would be met with overwhelming force. Raiders who once dared to enter the neon-lit streets found themselves gunned down in seconds, their bodies a warning to all who followed. Disputes between families, while tolerated to preserve the illusion of independence, were always carefully balanced, with House stepping in whenever one threatened to overstep. Outsiders who imagined that the Strip could be exploited quickly learned otherwise, for behind every negotiation, every invitation, every indulgence, lay the cold calculation of House himself, monitoring, adjusting, and ensuring that nothing occurred without serving his plan. The result was a city that felt alive, unpredictable, and decadent to those who visited. Yet in truth, it was a machine no less precise than the Securitrons who guarded it, each moving part controlled by the mind of Robert House, each outcome already foreseen in his models. To wastelanders accustomed to chaos, the strip's rebirth seemed miraculous, as if civilization itself had risen from the ashes in a single dazzling corridor of lights and luxury. Yet to House it was merely the first step, the necessary foundation upon which greater things would be built. New Vegas was not an end in itself, but a staging ground, a nucleus of stability that would serve as proof of concept for the civilization he intended to expand. In his mind, the Strip was both fortress and advertisement, a demonstration that under his leadership, humanity could achieve prosperity even amid ruin, and that those who resisted would find themselves either co-opted or destroyed. The forging of New Vegas was therefore not the tale of a city reborn, but the story of a single man's will imposed upon an entire region, bending tribes, economies, and symbols into alignment with his grand design. Where the NCR sought legitimacy through old-world constitutions, and Caesar through conquest and terror, House forged legitimacy from spectacle, from order, from the simple, undeniable fact that New Vegas worked. It was safe, it was prosperous, and it dazzled the imagination. And in the wasteland, that was enough to ensure loyalty. Thus, the Strip, reborn under House's hand, became the shining jewel of the Mojave, its casinos buzzing with life, its streets patrolled by machines, its neon lights proclaiming to every traveler that civilization had not died with the bombs. To outsiders, it was a place of decadence and opportunity. To House, it was the cornerstone of humanity's survival, a laboratory where he could refine the methods of control, manipulation, and progress that would one day extend far beyond the Mojave. The forging of New Vegas was the triumph of his patience and foresight, a reminder that while tribes rose and fell, while NCR and Legion prepared for war, Robert House had already laid the foundation of the only future worth pursuing, one that glittered in the desert night like a promise no wastelander could resist. The coming of the new California Republic into the Mojave marked a turning point in Robert House's centuries-long vigil, for whereas before the NCR had existed only as a distant force, its movements observed and catalogued from the height of the Lucky 38, by the late 70s, they began pressing aggressively into his sphere of influence, extending trade routes, establishing outposts, and claiming the Hoover Dam as both a strategic and symbolic prize. And House, who had spent generations preparing for this eventuality, recognized immediately that their expansion was both a threat and an opportunity, a predictable force he could manipulate to strengthen his dominion over New Vegas, while allowing them to bleed themselves against Caesar's legion, without risking the Strip or the fragile civilization he had painstakingly forged. Unlike the chaotic tribes that had roamed the Mojave for centuries, the NCR represented organization, manpower, and bureaucracy, an entity capable of building roads, establishing law, and projecting authority over vast distances. Yet House's centuries of observation had taught him that these strengths were balanced by weaknesses of ideology, corruption, and inefficiency, and he calculated that by exploiting these flaws, he could turn the Republic's expansion into a mechanism that would secure the Mojave's ultimate loyalty to him alone. From his tower, House monitored the NCR's movements with precision, cataloging supply lines, troop deployments, and political machinations with the same analytical rigor he had applied to pre-war economic models, noting every opportunity to leverage their presence for the benefit of the Strip. He understood that the NCR, driven by its ideals of law, order, and expansion, would naturally gravitate toward Hoover Dam, seeing it as a resource essential to consolidating power in the Mojave. Yet he also knew that their bureaucratic slowness, internal corruption, and political rivalries would render them vulnerable to miscalculation, allowing him to intervene at decisive moments. To that end, he activated the Strip's Securitron network fully, ensuring that the city was impervious to infiltration while also projecting an image of power to outsiders, and he communicated sparingly with NCR representatives, presenting himself not as a threat but as a magnate invested in local stability, a subtle deception that masked his true intention: to use the Republic's arrival as a tool to consolidate his own authority over the Mojave's most critical resources. The strategic significance of the Hoover Dam cannot be overstated in House's calculations, for it represented not only the largest source of hydroelectric power remaining in the post-war West, but also a symbol of technological continuity and human ingenuity that could serve as the foundation for his broader vision of a revitalized civilization. Control over the dam meant control over energy, trade, and influence, and House recognized that any attempt to seize it directly would invite open conflict with the NCR, or, eventually, Caesar's Legion, with potentially catastrophic consequences. Instead, he crafted a plan of indirect influence, allowing the NCR to assert its claim and draw the Legion into conflict, ensuring that both forces expended themselves while the Strip remained secure, and all the while he meticulously positioned contingencies, Securitron patrols, and infrastructure upgrades to ensure that, when the time came, he could intervene decisively to claim the dam for himself without risking the stability of New Vegas. House's interactions with NCR representatives were calculated with the precision of centuries of study. He appeared cooperative, reasonable, and invested in mutual prosperity. Yet every word, every concession, and every transaction served his ultimate goal. He allowed them to believe they were negotiating with a wealthy casino owner, not the architect of a regional power network who had survived 2 centuries of nuclear apocalypse and built a city capable of withstanding the collapse of any conventional military force. In public, he offered subtle assistance, safe passage for NCR caravans, limited trade agreements, and guidance through the Mojave, but always on terms that enhanced his leverage, always ensuring that the Strip's dominance was unassailable, and that the NCR remained dependent upon his city for commerce, intelligence, and security. Through these maneuvers, House not only preserved the independence of the Strip, but also positioned it as a critical node in the regional balance of power, a hub through which the NCR would inevitably become entangled in his larger plans. The arrival of NCR forces also served as a test of House's long-standing social engineering, for the 3 families had been trained and structured to maintain the Strip's functionality in the face of external threats. The chairman continued to project sophistication and charm, managing patrons and revenues, while the omertas controlled the shadowy dealings and enforced discipline when needed, and the white glove society ensured that the veneer of civility and order was never broken. House observed every interaction, every negotiation, and every potential point of friction, understanding that the family's loyalty and efficiency would be critical in counterbalancing the intrusive bureaucracy of the NCR. Any failure of governance within the Strip could have provided the Republic with an opening to assert direct control, and House's centuries of preparation ensured that no such failure would occur, that the city would function as an unassailable fortress and economic hub even as the NCR's influence crept ever closer. House's calculus of power extended beyond the Strip itself. He recognized that the Mojave, with its fragmented tribes and scattered settlements, presented a network of potential allies and obstacles that could be leveraged to influence the Republic's strategy. By subtly manipulating caravans, controlling trade routes, and occasionally directing Securitrons to intervene in local conflicts, he shaped the environment so that the NCR's advance reinforced his own position rather than threatening it. Every encounter, every skirmish, and every logistical bottleneck was anticipated and exploited, allowing House to convert the Republic's aggression into a tool for strengthening his dominion, ensuring that when the inevitable clash at Hoover Dam occurred, the NCR would be weakened, distracted, and dependent on the stability of New Vegas, which he controlled completely. The psychological dimension of House's strategy was equally deliberate. By presenting New Vegas as a beacon of order, wealth, and security, he created an irresistible magnet for NCR officials, merchants, and settlers alike, who increasingly relied on his city for both trade and refuge. The Strip's prosperity contrasted sharply with the chaos of the surrounding wasteland, reinforcing the notion that Robert House's authority was indispensable, and that his vision for civilization was both functional and superior to the Republic's expansionist efforts. NCR officers, unaware of the full extent of his power, often underestimated him, assuming that their numbers and bureaucracy could challenge him directly. Yet House knew that their inability to comprehend the depth of his preparation and the precision of his technological assets rendered them ineffective against his indirect strategies. In this way, he turned the NCR's strength into a liability, using their predictable impulses to guide them into outcomes that favored his ultimate goal of absolute control over the Mojave. By the time the Courier arrived, the NCR had firmly established itself as a regional force, and the Hoover Dam had become the focal point of inevitable conflict, a convergence of ambition, ideology, and strategy that House had foreseen decades in advance. His planning ensured that New Vegas would remain insulated from the chaos, that the Strip would continue to operate as a functioning city-state, and that both the Republic and the Legion would be drawn into a crucible from which only House could emerge, unchallenged. The coming of the NCR was therefore not a surprise, nor a threat in itself, but a critical element in the orchestration of his vision, a movable piece in the grand chessboard he had maintained for centuries, waiting for the precise moment when his intervention would convert regional conflict into his absolute advantage. Hoover Dam, in Robert House's calculations, was far more than a relic of pre-war engineering. It was the keystone upon which the future of the Mojave would be built, a structure whose control meant not merely electricity and water, but the ability to dictate the balance of power across a region scarred by nuclear fire. And House, whose mind had been sharpened over centuries of observation, regarded it with the intensity of a strategist surveying the final piece of a chessboard, knowing that the coming conflict between the new California Republic and Caesar's Legion would determine whether the Mojave fell to chaos or bent beneath the order of his vision. The dam, massive in both size and symbolic weight, represented a convergence of human ambition and technological achievement, and House understood that while either the NCR or the Legion could temporarily claim it through force, neither possessed the combination of foresight, preparation, and technological mastery required to maintain long-term control. and this knowledge informed every move he made in the lead-up to the inevitable confrontation. For decades he had observed both powers, calculating their strengths and weaknesses, cataloging their supply lines, leadership tendencies, and military doctrines, and he had formulated a strategy in which New Vegas, under his complete control, would remain insulated, while the two giants expended themselves in a conflict of attrition that would leave the victor weakened, dependent, and ultimately subject to his ultimate authority. House's preparations for the defense and eventual assertion of influence over Hoover Dam were meticulous in every detail, reflecting both his understanding of human nature and his mastery of technology, for he recognized that conventional fortifications and armies were insufficient to ensure dominance over forces as vast as the NCR or as disciplined as Caesar's legion. And so he invested heavily in his Securitron network, upgrading their weaponry, improving their sensors, and coordinating them with automated turrets, surveillance arrays, and logistical nodes throughout the Strip and surrounding areas, creating a layered defense that would render New Vegas impervious to attack, while simultaneously projecting power across the Mojave. This technological infrastructure allowed House to extend his reach far beyond the city, monitoring troop movements along the river, assessing the flow of resources to and from the dam, and intervening subtly to ensure that engagements between NCR and Legion forces unfolded in ways that favored his long-term goals, while minimizing risk to his city and the people he had conditioned to serve his vision. Each Securitron, each automated system, and each hidden defensive measure was a manifestation of his philosophy that human folly must be anticipated and that precision and foresight are superior to brute force or ideology. House's strategic vision extended beyond mere defense. He sought to manipulate the conflict itself, allowing the NCR and Legion to weaken each other, while ensuring that the Strip and Hoover Dam remained untouched until the decisive moment when his intervention could convert the chaos into absolute advantage. To that end, he orchestrated scenarios in which each faction would encounter obstacles calculated to frustrate but not destroy them, using the terrain, pre-positioned resources, and intelligence gathered from both spies and automated monitoring to subtly shape the flow of battle. He understood that both the Republic and the Legion would act predictably within their respective doctrines. The NCR, relying on formal military tactics, infrastructure, and supply chains, and the Legion relying on speed, discipline, and terror, and he leveraged these predictable tendencies to construct a scenario in which each would neutralize the other's strengths, expend resources, and commit forces to attrition that left them vulnerable to his final, decisive action. In House's mind, the conflict was a living experiment in human and organizational behavior, a grand test of strategy that would confirm the superiority of foresight and technology over raw numbers or ideology. The psychological component of House's plan was as critical as the technological, for he understood that perception shapes behavior and that both the NCR and the Legion were susceptible to manipulation through appearances of inevitability, dominance, and prestige. New Vegas, fully operational and brimming with life, wealth, and spectacle, served as a tangible reminder of his power. A city-state that was both fortified and thriving, its neon lights an unspoken threat that the Mojave's factions could not ignore. The presence of the Securitrons patrolling the Strip, visible to NCR scouts and travelers alike, created a perception of invincibility, reinforcing the notion that House was a singular figure whose intelligence and preparation surpassed that of any conventional army. and that engagement with New Vegas itself would be folly. This projection of strength allowed House to manipulate both factions without direct confrontation, guiding their actions through the combination of fear, respect, and the invisible hand of his surveillance, while ensuring that all roads ultimately led to a confrontation on his terms at Hoover Dam. House also leveraged economic and political channels to secure his position in the region, for he knew that control over Hoover Dam was not merely a matter of military might, but also of influence over trade, resources, and allegiances. NCR supply lines were deliberately routed through channels he monitored. Caravans were subtly encouraged or discouraged depending on how they might affect the eventual outcome, and negotiations with both factions were carefully calibrated to extract concessions while masking his true intentions. By maintaining an appearance of neutrality, even as he subtly guided events in his favor, House ensured that the Mojave's balance of power would bend toward his ultimate control without exposing New Vegas to the full force of conflict prematurely. In this way, Hoover Dam became more than a battlefield. It became a theater of strategy, a stage upon which House could orchestrate the culmination of decades, even centuries, of preparation. The arrival of the Courier added a final variable to House's calculations, an agent whose choices would intersect with his designs, and whose loyalty could tip the balance decisively. House's long-term planning accounted for the existence of such actors, for he recognized that the wasteland was unpredictable, that human agency could disrupt even the most meticulously constructed scenarios, and that flexibility was as essential to strategy as foresight. By preparing contingencies for the Courier's potential actions, whether alignment with NCR, allegiance to Legion, or cooperation with House himself, he ensured that the final confrontation at Hoover Dam could be managed under his control, that no deviation would undermine the broader plan, and that the culmination of his vision for New Vegas and the Mojave remained secure. The Courier, in essence, became another piece in the grand game, a tool that could be guided to secure the ultimate triumph of House's will over the chaos surrounding him. Thus, Hoover Dam stood not merely as a location of conflict, but as the crucible in which Robert House's centuries-long plan would be tested, a point of convergence for ambition, strategy, and technology, and a proving ground for the superiority of foresight, preparation, and intellect over both numerical strength and ideological zeal. From the vantage of the Lucky 38, House watched, calculated, and anticipated, confident that the convergence of NCR and Legion forces would create the precise conditions for him to assert unchallenged dominance, to transform the Mojave into a bastion of civilization, and to demonstrate, once and for all, that his vision, tempered by centuries of survival, was the only enduring path forward in a world ravaged by war. Hoover Dam was not merely a structure, it was the axis upon which the future of the Mojave would turn, and Robert House, master strategist, long-lived architect, and unseen sovereign, had ensured that he alone controlled the lever that would tip it. The arrival of the Courier in the Mojave represented a variable in Robert House's centuries-long strategy, an unpredictable element that could either accelerate, complicate, or entirely reshape the execution of his vision. For while House had meticulously calculated every movement of the NCR, every advance of Caesar's Legion, and every mechanical deployment of his Securitron army, human agency, particularly that of someone as capable and resourceful as the Courier, introduced an element of uncertainty that required careful monitoring, subtle manipulation, and adaptive planning to ensure that New Vegas remained secure and that the ultimate consolidation of power over the Mojave proceeded according to his design, the Courier's entrance was at once a disruption and an opportunity, a living variable whose choices would reflect the intersection of morality, pragmatism, and ambition, in a world where the old rules had long since collapsed. From the moment the Courier stepped off the Mojave Express, House's network of sensors, informants, and automated surveillance registered every action, every conversation, every decision, feeding his calculations in real time, allowing him to anticipate potential threats or opportunities, and to deploy interventions with precision, from discrete instructions through holographic interfaces to the subtle nudging of alliances, conflicts, and resource flows across the desert landscape, all aimed at ensuring that the Courier's path, while appearing independent, ultimately served to strengthen House's overarching plan for the Mojave. House understood immediately the Courier's capabilities, their survival through ambush, ability to navigate complex terrain, aptitude for negotiation and combat, and capacity to influence factions across the wasteland made them far more than a simple messenger. They were a force multiplier, a single agent capable of shifting the balance between NCR and Legion, guiding tribal allegiances, and tipping outcomes in critical engagements, including the anticipated conflict at Hoover Dam. Yet House also recognized the inherent danger in this autonomy. For the Courier, driven by personal motivations, moral judgment, or simple pragmatism, might choose to oppose his authority, undermine his carefully orchestrated strategies, or align with forces that would destabilize New Vegas at a critical moment. To mitigate this, House implemented a strategy of both observation and subtle engagement, providing guidance, resources, and selective opportunities that allowed the Courier to exercise free will while keeping the ultimate consequences aligned with the trajectory he had designed over decades. In essence, the Courier became both a test and an instrument, a living variable through which House could evaluate the efficacy of his planning while shaping the Mojave's fate without direct intervention. House's engagement with the Courier was conducted with the same measured precision that defined his interactions with the NCR and the three families. He did not reveal his full scope of knowledge or control, presenting himself as a powerful magnate concerned with the prosperity of New Vegas, yet simultaneously offering insights, tools, and missions that guided the Courier to perform actions that would stabilize the Strip, weaken potential threats, and consolidate House's influence over the surrounding territories. From strategic directives delivered through holographic communication to carefully crafted hints about the nature of Hoover Dam's significance, House subtly ensured that the Courier's interventions aligned with his goals, exploiting the agent's independence to maximize outcomes while minimizing exposure to risk, thereby transforming apparent unpredictability into a controllable component of his broader strategy. Each assignment, each decision, each interaction with the Mojave's factions became a measured step along a path preordained by House's meticulous foresight, a chess move executed by a pawn whose mobility was apparent but whose constraints had been subtly engineered. The Courier's impact extended to every corner of the Mojave, from the outlying tribes to NCR encampments, from the Legion's forward positions to trade caravans crossing the deserts, and House leveraged this influence with a level of calculation that few could comprehend, monitoring the ripple effects of each choice and adjusting his own deployments accordingly. When the Courier secured alliances, diverted forces, or eliminated obstacles, House interpreted these actions as validations of his predictive models, recalibrating contingencies to account for evolving circumstances, and ensuring that the Strip remained insulated from the chaos that might otherwise spill over from the surrounding wasteland. Even when the Courier acted unpredictably, House's layered surveillance, technological dominance, and prepositioned securitrons allowed him to absorb deviations, redirect their consequences, and maintain the integrity of his long-term plan, exemplifying his philosophy that control arises not solely from brute force, but from the anticipation of every eventuality and the capacity to manipulate outcomes across space, time, and human behavior. House's evaluation of the Courier was both strategic and psychological. He recognized that their choices could influence the morale, loyalty, and alignment of factions throughout the Mojave. By granting the Courier agency, he created a perception of independence that encouraged trust, initiative, and engagement from local actors, while simultaneously ensuring that the structural constraints of the Strip, the Securitron network, and the alignment of the three families imposed boundaries within which all outcomes would ultimately reinforce his authority. The Courier, unaware of the full depth of House's surveillance and the degree to which their environment was orchestrated, moved freely across the Mojave, influencing battles, trade, and alliances, yet each success, each redirection, and each intervention invariably strengthened House's strategic position, demonstrating the elegance of his centuries-long approach to governance, influence, and technological mastery. In effect, the Courier became the living embodiment of House's philosophy, a single agent whose freedom was bounded by invisible structures, whose choices appeared autonomous but were continuously shaped by foresight, and whose actions accelerated the realization of a vision that spanned generations. Ultimately, the Courier's arrival highlighted the genius of House's approach to power in the Mojave. Rather than confronting every threat directly, he cultivated an environment in which capable actors could operate independently, yet inevitably produce outcomes that aligned with his objectives. The NCR, the Legion, the three families, and now the Courier were all participants in a complex system of interdependencies, carefully managed and observed from the vantage of the Lucky 38, where House's intellect and technology ensured that New Vegas remained insulated, dominant, and prepared for the climactic convergence at Hoover Dam. Through subtle influence, selective guidance, and precise intervention, the Courier's presence became a force that amplified House's control, demonstrating the enduring principle that foresight, preparation, and strategic manipulation are superior to brute force or ideology, and that even in the unpredictable post-war world, a singular mind, armed with knowledge and technology, could shape the course of history with deliberate precision. In the context of New Vegas and the Mojave, the Courier was not merely a wanderer, a mercenary, or a messenger. They were the ultimate test of House's centuries-long planning, the proof that his surveillance, social engineering, and technological mastery could accommodate unpredictability while still achieving predetermined outcomes, and a living demonstration that a civilization rebuilt under House's guidance would endure because it was engineered to withstand the variable, the chaotic, and the human. By the time the Courier's path intersected with Hoover Dam, the Strip was secure, the three families loyal, and both the NCR and Legion were moving inexorably toward the decisive engagement, all under the subtle orchestration of Robert House, who had transformed the arrival of a single individual into an instrument of strategy, ensuring that every choice, every alliance, and every confrontation would ultimately serve the singular, centuries-spanning vision of New Vegas as a bastion of order, prosperity, and enduring human achievement. The strategies at Hoover Dam represented the culmination of Robert House's centuries-long preparation, a carefully orchestrated convergence of planning, technology, and human behavior, for by the time both the new California Republic and Caesar's Legion approached the dam, House had already analyzed every conceivable outcome, calculated the optimal positioning of forces, and deployed contingencies to ensure that the battle, while appearing chaotic and unpredictable to outsiders, would unfold in precise accordance with his vision, and his strategy extended not merely to the deployment of Securitrons and control of New Vegas, but to the manipulation of both factions' psychology, logistics, and chain of command, ensuring that the NCR's bureaucratic tendencies would slow their responses, that the Legion's reliance on fear and obedience would make them predictable, and that the Courier's interventions, if aligned with his objectives, would amplify his influence and accelerate the resolution in his favor. House's approach was not one of open confrontation, but of subtle orchestration, a game of leverage in which every movement by the NCR, the Legion, or the Courier fed into a broader schema of attrition, distraction, and ultimate consolidation of power. And from the Lucky 38, he monitored the unfolding dynamics with the analytical precision of a strategist centuries ahead of his adversaries, adjusting deployments, recalibrating intelligence feeds, and issuing directives to his machines to shape events with unerring precision. House's strategies were multifaceted, combining technological superiority, economic manipulation, psychological insight, and social engineering to ensure that the battle at Hoover Dam would serve his interests regardless of its immediate victor. For he understood that victory in conventional terms was secondary to long-term control, and that by leveraging the conflict between the NCR and the Legion, he could consolidate his own dominion over the Mojave and the Strip, without exposing his city or assets to undue risk. He had positioned his Securitrons to dominate critical access points, establishing a layered network of defense that would neutralize any threat to New Vegas itself, and he had coordinated their patrols, firepower, and reconnaissance capabilities to act autonomously, yet in strict alignment with his strategic objectives, allowing him to exert influence across the battlefield without direct engagement, a masterstroke of automation and foresight that exemplified his philosophy that technology, intelligence, and planning outweigh brute force or numerical superiority. Simultaneously, House ensured that supply lines, communication routes, and logistical choke points for both the NCR and Legion were subtly manipulated, creating scenarios in which delays, miscommunications, and attrition would systematically weaken each faction while preserving his own leverage. And by doing so, he transformed the chaotic violence of war into a predictable instrument of advantage. The psychological dimension of House's strategy at Hoover Dam was equally critical, for he understood that perception, fear, and morale could be as decisive as firepower or numbers, and he manipulated the beliefs of both factions to align with his overarching plan. NCR troops, confident in their bureaucratic hierarchy and accustomed to chain-of-command decisions, were often diverted by delays, obstacles, and misinformation, reinforcing the perception that New Vegas and its master were omnipotent, while Legion soldiers, disciplined but rigid in their adherence to Caesar's commands, were predictably funneled into positions that maximized attrition and exposure to hazards, ensuring that their aggression would contribute to their own depletion. The Courier, operating as an independent agent, introduced variability, yet House accounted for this by anticipating possible interventions and contingencies, ensuring that every choice the Courier made, whether to support the NCR, the Legion, or House directly, could be absorbed into the broader strategy and exploited to reinforce his dominance, a demonstration of his ability to integrate human unpredictability into a deterministic system of control. House's use of the three families in the lead-up to the Hoover Dam confrontation exemplified his ability to coordinate multiple social, economic, and operational elements simultaneously for each family's actions on the Strip, whether maintaining order, managing trade, or projecting influence to visiting NCR or Legion representatives, reinforced the illusion of a thriving independent city, while subtly ensuring that every transaction, negotiation, or conflict furthered House's strategic aims. The chairman, Omatas, and White Glove Society acted as extensions of his will, their positions, resources, and interactions carefully calibrated to maintain stability within the Strip, while simultaneously creating channels for intelligence gathering, diversion, and subtle coercion across the Mojave, allowing House to control both perception and reality simultaneously. In this way, the Strip became more than a fortress or a city. It became an active instrument of strategy, a nexus through which the complex dynamics of the Mojave were filtered, shaped, and ultimately aligned with House's centuries-spanning vision. As the conflict at Hoover Dam drew near, House maintained a delicate balance, allowing skirmishes and engagements to occur in ways that weakened both the NCR and the Legion, while ensuring that New Vegas remained insulated and fully operational, its Securitrons unmoved by the surrounding chaos, and its economy unaffected by the disruption of regional trade. His ability to observe, anticipate, and intervene remotely transformed a potentially catastrophic clash into a controlled experiment in power, demonstrating that preparation, foresight, and technological mastery could bend even large-scale human conflict to the will of a single individual, provided that individual possessed sufficient intelligence, patience, and resources. House's meticulous planning ensured that every variable, from troop morale to logistics, from environmental hazards to the unpredictable interventions of the Courier, was accounted for, integrated, and leveraged, creating a scenario in which the culmination of conflict would ultimately strengthen his authority and secure the Strip's dominance indefinitely. Ultimately, the strategies at Hoover Dam represented the apex of House's approach to control, blending centuries of observation, technological superiority, social manipulation, and strategic patience into a single, coherent plan that would allow him to shape the Mojave's fate without exposing New Vegas to unnecessary risk. He had transformed a chaotic landscape of competing factions, primitive tribes, and post-war unpredictability into a controlled system in which every outcome, every choice, and every movement was measured against his objectives, ensuring that the Strip remained secure, the three families loyal, and both the NCR and the Legion positioned for maximal attrition. Hoover Dam was therefore not merely a physical battleground, but a stage for the demonstration of House's genius, the culmination of centuries of planning, and a proving ground for the principle that foresight, technology, and strategic manipulation can achieve results far beyond what conventional military power or ideology alone could accomplish. In House's vision, the Dam, the Mojave, and the Strip were all elements of a single, integrated system, one that would emerge from the chaos of conflict with him as its unchallenged master, demonstrating the enduring efficacy of intelligence, preparation, and the calculated orchestration of human and mechanical forces alike. The Battle of Hoover Dam, as envisioned and orchestrated by Robert House, was not a spontaneous eruption of violence, but the culmination of centuries of preparation, a meticulously designed convergence of forces, psychology, and technology, in which every movement of the new California Republic, Caesar's Legion, the Three Families, and even the Courier, was anticipated, monitored, and manipulated to achieve the singular outcome of House's absolute control over the Mojave. For while outsiders perceived chaos, uncertainty, and the randomness of war, House's mind operated with the clarity of a chess master, viewing the board several moves ahead, calculating the attrition of NCR and Legion forces, the precise timing of reinforcements, and the optimal positioning of Securitrons and automated defenses to ensure that New Vegas remained insulated from the conflict, while both factions expended themselves in ways that maximized their own depletion, and every tactical decision, skirmish, and logistical maneuver unfolded under his invisible hand. The dam itself, massive and imposing, became the focal point of the confrontation, a physical and symbolic nexus upon which the fates of thousands of combatants and the strategic future of the Mojave would hinge. Yet for House it was more than a battlefield. It was the instrument through which he would assert dominance without risking the fragile civilization he had painstakingly rebuilt, and the success of the engagement would depend as much on subtle manipulation as on firepower, with every factor, from terrain to morale, from supply lines to communication networks, accounted for in his comprehensive models of human behavior and military logistics. House's orchestration of the battle leveraged his technological superiority in the form of the Securitron network, a combination of heavily armed, self-directed machines capable of defending New Vegas, projecting power into key strategic locations, and neutralizing threats with precise efficiency, and he deployed them not as a blunt instrument of destruction, but as an adaptive system that could react to changing circumstances while remaining fully aligned with his preordained strategy, ensuring that even if NCR or Legion forces attempted maneuvers designed to seize advantage, they would encounter resistance calculated to exhaust, divert, or channel them into outcomes favorable to House. Simultaneously, the three families played their assigned roles with exacting adherence to House's instructions, the chairman maintaining order and the illusion of normalcy within the strip, the Omertas controlling covert operations and shadow security, and the White Glove Society reinforcing the veneer of authority and elegance, each family's actions amplifying House's control over both perception and reality, transforming the strip itself into an active participant in the broader conflict, and a center of influence capable of shaping the battlefield from afar. Even the Courier, whose autonomy introduced variability, was accounted for in House's planning, with contingencies prepared for their choices whether they aligned with NCR, Legion, or House directly, so that every possible outcome could be absorbed into his system without compromising the city's safety or his overarching objectives. The clash between NCR and Legion forces unfolded largely according to House's predictions, with the NCR relying on structured tactics, supply lines, and fortifications, while the Legion utilized disciplined aggression, rapid maneuvers, and psychological intimidation. Yet both were subtly constrained by the manipulations of House's planning, for he had ensured that terrain, timing, and intelligence favored attrition over outright victory, weakening both factions while preserving his own leverage. Skirmishes erupted at key choke points, reinforcements arrived slightly delayed or redirected, and supply convoys encountered engineered obstacles, all serving to erode the combat effectiveness of the opposing sides without exposing New Vegas to risk. And in this way, the battle became less a contest of brute force and more a demonstration of House's foresight, patience, and mastery of the variables that govern human conflict. As the engagement intensified, the psychological effect of the Securitron's presence and the strip's unwavering stability created doubt, hesitation, and a sense of inevitability among both NCR and Legion troops, reinforcing House's goal of guiding the conflict to an outcome of minimal disruption to his city, while maximal depletion of opposing forces. House's attention to the minutiae of strategy extended to the control of resources and supply, for he understood that both the NCR and the Legion were constrained by logistical realities, and by selectively manipulating these constraints, through control of trade routes, interference with convoys, and strategic deployment of Securitrons to key positions, he forced both factions to operate under conditions that amplified errors, slowed advancement, and increased attrition, effectively allowing him to wage war through indirect influence rather than direct engagement. Every misstep by the NCR or the Legion, every delay or miscommunication, was anticipated and exploited to reinforce House's dominance, demonstrating his principle that true power derives not from numbers alone, but from the ability to shape circumstances so that one's opponents are compelled to act in ways that advance one's own objectives. Even the unpredictable movements of the Courier, often decisive in localized encounters, were integrated seamlessly into this grand design, with House adjusting deployments, modifying surveillance priorities, and subtly redirecting the Securitrons to capitalize on emergent situations while maintaining the overarching trajectory of his strategy. As the battle progressed, the cumulative effects of House's orchestration became evident. NCR forces found themselves stretched thin, forced to commit to engagements that gradually depleted their manpower and morale. Legion forces advanced with discipline but encountered engineered bottlenecks and hazards that eroded their effectiveness, and New Vegas remained unscathed, a luminous fortress whose Securitrons, surveillance networks, and loyal three families ensured that no threat penetrated the city's perimeter. From the Lucky 38, House observed these developments with calculated detachment, noting the fulfillment of predictions, the emergence of unanticipated variables, and the adaptive responses of all actors, and he adjusted contingencies in real time to maintain equilibrium and ensure that the ultimate outcome, the consolidation of power over the Mojave under his authority, remained inevitable. The dam itself, a locus of destruction and strategy, became a controlled environment in which House's foresight transformed apparent chaos into a deterministic process, validating centuries of preparation and proving the efficacy of intelligence, technology, and subtle manipulation in determining the fate of civilizations. Ultimately, the Battle of Hoover Dam concluded not merely as a military engagement, but as the demonstration of House's mastery over the Mojave, the NCR, Caesar's Legion, the Courier, and the intricate web of social, economic, and technological forces under his influence. For when the dust settled, New Vegas remained secure. The Strip continued to flourish under the guidance of the three families, and the opposing factions were left diminished, redirected, or absorbed into a balance that reinforced House's vision, illustrating the principle that control achieved through foresight, patience, and strategic orchestration is far more enduring than victory achieved by force alone. The engagement confirmed the superiority of House's methodology by leveraging human psychology, technological assets, logistical control, and the careful shaping of events over time, he had transformed the chaos of war into a predictable instrument of power, ensuring that the Mojave's future would unfold according to his plan, and demonstrating that a single, disciplined mind, armed with preparation and precision, could bend even the most formidable adversaries to its will. The realization of Robert House's vision following the Battle of Hoover Dam represented the culmination of centuries of planning, foresight, and technological mastery, for with the NCR weakened, Caesar's legion diverted, and the Courier's actions integrated into his grand design, House emerged as the uncontested architect of New Vegas, and the Mojave, his influence extending not only across the Strip, but throughout the surrounding territories, shaping the political, economic, and social landscape according to a vision that had been meticulously conceived long before the first bombs fell. And this consolidation of power was not the result of brute force alone, but of the careful orchestration of every variable within his reach, from the loyalty and management of the three families, to the deployment of Securitrons, the manipulation of trade and supply networks, and the psychological shaping of both allies and adversaries, ensuring that every actor operated within boundaries that ultimately reinforced his authority while maintaining the appearance of autonomy and normalcy. In the aftermath of the conflict, the Strip stood as a testament to House's genius. Fully operational, secure, and thriving, its neon lights, a visible declaration that civilization could endure even in a world ravaged by nuclear fire, and that such endurance required not mere survival, but the deliberate, intelligent imposition of order upon chaos, a principle that had guided House's actions for over 2 centuries. With his dominance unchallenged, House implemented policies and strategies to stabilize the Mojave under his oversight, extending infrastructure, security, and economic influence beyond the Strip, while maintaining the delicate balance between the various factions. For he understood that control was most durable when it appeared organic rather than imposed, when human actors believed themselves autonomous even as their actions contributed to a larger, centralized plan, and when the mechanisms of enforcement, surveillance, and reward operated seamlessly to preserve the city's prosperity and his supremacy. Trade routes were optimized and protected, ensuring the flow of goods and resources to both New Vegas and the surrounding settlements. While Securitrons maintained security and order, their presence simultaneously a deterrent to rebellion and a visible symbol of House's technological mastery. The three families, their ambitions contained and directed, functioned as instruments of governance, managing the city's internal affairs and projecting stability outward, while the broader Mojave came to recognize New Vegas as both a sanctuary and a center of influence, a hub where commerce, information, and power converged under House's unseen hand. House's vision extended beyond mere survival or economic control. He sought the creation of a civilization that could endure the unpredictability of the post-war world, a model in which technology, strategy, and human agency were harmonized under a singular guiding intellect, and where progress could be measured not in transient gains, but in the sustained stability and prosperity of the population. Education, commerce, and culture were subtly encouraged, with the Strip functioning as a center of refinement and spectacle that attracted visitors and settlers alike, while maintaining the underlying discipline and order essential to its survival. And every element, from the design of the casinos to the allocation of resources, from the enforcement of law to the management of alliances, was calibrated to ensure that the city's success reinforced House's ultimate authority. His mastery of information, observation, and manipulation allowed him to anticipate potential challenges, neutralize threats before they could materialize, and integrate the actions of independent actors, including the Courier, into outcomes that furthered the long-term consolidation of power, demonstrating that true leadership in the Mojave required not merely dominance, but preemptive control over the variables that govern human behavior and societal stability. Economically, New Vegas under House became a self-sustaining hub of trade and commerce, a city whose prosperity radiated outward to the Mojave, attracting caravans, merchants, and settlers, while ensuring that regional dependency on the Strip reinforced his authority, for trade was not simply a matter of wealth, but a tool of influence, allowing House to shape relationships, reward loyalty, and marginalize potential adversaries without direct conflict. Every transaction, every shipment, every market interaction was a thread in a complex web that tied the surrounding settlements and factions to the stability and benevolence, or the control, of House, and through this economic network, the Mojave came to reflect his strategic philosophy, a system in which freedom and order coexisted, autonomy was permitted within boundaries, and prosperity was inseparable from allegiance to the architect of civilization who had endured beyond time itself. Socially and politically, House's influence permeated every aspect of life in New Vegas and the surrounding Mojave. With his surveillance networks and the loyalty of the three families, ensuring that both overt and covert dissent could be addressed quickly, efficiently, and without destabilizing the broader order, and through subtle manipulations, he maintained the appearance of pluralism while retaining absolute control, creating a society in which choices were guided, outcomes predicted, and power concentrated in ways invisible to all but the most discerning observers. The NCR, though present in the region, found itself constrained by dependence on New Vegas, its authority diluted by attrition and the strategic manipulations House had imposed during the Hoover Dam conflict. While Caesar's legion remained contained, their expansion checked, not through direct confrontation, but through the intelligent deployment of resources and influence, and in this way, House transformed external threats into instruments for reinforcing his internal consolidation, turning potential adversaries into unwitting partners in the realization of his long-term vision. Ultimately, the realization of House's vision was not merely the achievement of power, but the creation of a sustainable civilization capable of enduring the challenges of the post-war world, a system in which technology, strategy, and human ambition were harmonized under a singular guiding intellect, and where prosperity, stability, and cultural refinement coexisted with the quiet enforcement of order, the surveillance of potential threats, and the careful orchestration of human activity to ensure continuity and success. New Vegas became both a symbol and a functional hub of this vision, a city whose neon lights shone as proof that civilization could thrive even amidst ruins, and whose survival was guaranteed not by luck, ideology, or brute strength, but by the careful, patient, and unrelenting application of foresight, intelligence, and technology by a man whose life spanned centuries, and whose mind had always operated several moves ahead of the world around him. Robert House had achieved what few could imagine, the transformation of a desolate, post-apocalyptic landscape into a bastion of civilization, the consolidation of power across factions, and the creation of a system in which human agency was guided to serve the enduring stability of the Mojave, ensuring that the vision of New Vegas would persist as a testament to the genius, patience, and enduring authority of its architect.